Good morning, and welcome to this live stream webinar, public webinar, with Dr. Frank Thomas of Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm just so pleased to be able to welcome you to this event, now being live streamed. And let me also say, if you are participating by live stream, you can actually pose a question later. You notice up on the screen that if you have questions for Dr. Thomas this morning, you can email those to donahue@bu.edu. So I hope you'll want to take part. We'll have a chance to hear from Dr. Thomas for a bit and open up for questions as well. So I want to let you know that this event is sponsored by the Homiletical Theology Project, and the funds for the event came from the Center for Practical Theology. I want to acknowledge that wonderful gift. It's a great pleasure for me as a teacher at BU School of Theology to welcome my colleague from Christian Theological Seminary. Many of you who've taken courses with me will know that we spend a lot of time looking at this book from the turn of the century, 9/11/01, African American Leaders Respond to an American Tragedy. We use this volume at BU to talk about the problem of situational preaching. How do you articulate the gospel after something really awful has happened? How do you name that in that situation? And Dr. Thomas was one of the co-editors of this book that brought together fascinating sermons from across the spectrum among African American leaders after 9/11. So many of you are already familiar with this work or will be soon in the intro course, but I wanted to be sure you had a chance to meet one of the authors of that book to speak today. You'll notice over my shoulder is another book title that we will be referencing today. This one is also from Dr. Thomas, called Introduction to the Practice of African American Preaching, which was published about 3 years ago. And we'll be looking today at chapter 2, talking about the relationship of rhetoric and theology in preaching, which is an issue near and dear to my heart. And just so pleased to have Dr. Thomas here to talk about that. And just one more little book plug before we get started. One of his more recent books is How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, which came out from Abingdon Press not too long ago. And a sequel called How to Survive a Dangerous Sermon that's coming out in 2 months. So if you're waiting still to survive, hold on. 2 more months and the sequel to this book will be out as well, and you will be well informed and you will be ready for anything that comes your way. So I would like to turn to my colleague now, Dr. Frank Thomas. I'm just so grateful that he's here to be with us today as part of this special event to the Homiletical Theology Project and the Center for Practical Theology, and to welcome him to BU School of Theology. Dr. Thomas.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me, and it's always a wonderful opportunity to talk about preaching, but given our relationship, I'm deeply appreciative that all the people you could have had, you chose to have me, so I'm honored to be here. So I think I want to start just really talking about preaching, and particularly African American preaching, and then kind of move forward. My parents were loosely connected to the church. Upon my growing up, they were Christmas, Mother's Day, Easter kind of attendance. And so because the public schools, my mother was a public school teacher in Chicago, she moved me to a Lutheran school in my 8th grade year to get a better education. And I went to high school at a Lutheran school as well. And then I went to college at University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. And while I was at college, I was participating in a Lutheran Christian group that's kind of not involved, but not deeply involved, but there regularly and growing, etc. And a friend of mine used to live behind the alley. Some people know what alley is, but in Chicago, there's an alley. It's house, alley, house, right? Mm-hmm. So he was killed in a botched robbery attempt. He was working part-time for a shoe store, going to school during the day and working at night. And the funeral services were held at a church on 83rd and Damon in Chicago. An African-American preacher named L.K. Curry, still alive, still preaching, 93, 94 years old. And I was one of a member of a group of probably 250 young people in that audience, distraught. Young people, when you're young, you live with a kind of inevitability. You're not going to die. And when death happens, it hits you. And I remember how distraught that room was. But when that black preacher got up and preached and got through, I felt better.
Mm.
And it started me on a journey to ask the question, how do you take an audience of people who are distraught and move them to a place of hope? And I had been close enough to the church, of course, and part of it, enough to know that it was God and it was Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
But it was something about that preacher.
Mm-hmm.
And so it started a kind of love for me of black preaching. And had no idea I'd be a preacher, no idea I'd wear a preacher, had no idea I'd write books on any of this. I was just fascinated. How do you take a person in despair to hope? And that seemed to be at the heart of the gospel, particularly given the social context. I live on the south side of Chicago. Chicago is very divided. You remember Dr. King said, I graduated from high school in 1973, so in the 60s I was in Chicago growing up. And we had that incident in Cicero where Dr. King says he hadn't seen this kind of racism in the South that he's looking at in Cicero right there in Chicago. So that was the kind of climate. So it kind of acclimated me to, and I'll give you one more story. We were the second family, black family that moved on a block on 86th Street. We moved from 63rd to 86th. And I learned white flight. Because we had lived basically with all black people. And so I learned that when the black kids, like we would come out, the white parents would make the kids come in. And it was tension, and I could feel it and see it. So my mother, in 1966, put out a Santa for Christmas decorations and painted the Santa brown.
Mm-hmm.
And it stirred on that block. So when people say, where do you get this somewhat radical bent? Well, my mother. I looked at that, and it was like, that's what I tell you last night. My definition of rhetoric is that, she put out a black Santa to claim space for a black presence on that block.
Yeah.
And so I've kept that and learned that. So if you take both the ability of a preaching tradition to take people from despair to hope, found and grounded in the experience of racism, oppression, hatred, violence, lynching, I could go on, and mass incarceration, I could go on and on and on. The African-American preaching tradition has always found a way to bring hope. And so what I also combine with the theology of the preaching is the rhetorical side.
Right.
So when I was a pastor in Memphis and a professor of rhetoric, I did a Linton series. I was a preacher for a Linton series in Memphis. It was prominent, large, people come all over the city. And after the worship service, you go downstairs, they had chicken and waffles, they had food, and so they put he's a professor, they put him at the table with me. So he said, you should come over and study rhetoric. I said, well, why should I come over and study rhetoric? He said, because you're a natural at it. So I said, well, I'm a pastor, I'm much too busy for any of that. So the next year they invited me back. He came back, they put him at the same table. He said, remember last year I asked you to come, why don't you just come? He said, come over and take one class. Just come over and take one class. So I got to take one class.
Yeah.
And he said, you find that you'd enjoy it. I took that class and just enjoyed it. The art of persuasion, and studying audience studies, and looking at, what persuasive choices a preacher is making in the sermon. So, and I realized that inherently African-American preaching is rhetorical. Inherently. You can't divide, what you say and how you say what you say. And so I studied rhetoric. I ended up, I took another class, and then, it's like, well, why don't you just make application to be a student? So I got 18 hours. I formed a committee, and I went through the conference exams, and so I graduated and got my PhD, studying in essence the rhetoric of hope in the preaching of Martin Luther King the last year of his life, 67, 68. So then when I went to the Academy of Homiletics, because at the time I was teaching preaching adjunct, I was already involved in the Academy of Homiletics, there was a big discussion about rhetoric.
I remember that, yeah.
and Lucy Lynn Hogan and Richard Lisher, and it looks like Lisher won, which was the church don't need rhetoric to.
Well, he wrote an article called "Why I'm Not Persuasive," right? Which was
I use it in the
I'm sure, yeah.
In the Lucy Lynn Hogan.
It's a fun article that way, but.
In the whole incarnation of it.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the class, we're having a huge debate. And Bill Lamar, who studied with Lisher at Duke, he showed us how, his argument was a little bit deeper than that, and it was really the reality of the church that need the world's language to express its truth. That the church has its own language, so why do we have to use rhetorical tools, which is the traditional argument, except that, I agree with that, except the church still, the language has to be incarnated.
Yeah.
Which makes it.
Yeah. That's a theological grounding
Exactly.
for a way of thinking about rhetoric that pushes it beyond the mere theoretical debate of its value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when God got ready to speak to human beings, God showed up. Jesus. Right. To me, that's a rhetorical act. So Jesus could articulate God. Right. So anyway, from that, I wrote the chapter 2 that you referred to, initially starting out talking about that in the field of homiletics, and then also in the history of the church. I mean, because Paul says, "I don't come with wise, I'm not with eloquence," which is the rhetorical side. I don't come with rhetorical training.
Right.
I'm not like Apollo. What I come with is the demonstration of the Spirit's power.
Right.
So, and then I went to Augustine, and the chapter is long, and then Karl Barth, who sticks a knife in rhetoric, and then Buttrick, and so all that stuff is in chapter U. Making an argument, and then through tracing the history of it in Euro-American preaching, all over from church history, patristics, all the way up. Then I said, well, for the black church, it's always been inherently rhetorical, because if the slave master is in the audience and the preacher is up preaching, the preacher can't say, that these slave masters are not going to heaven. So what the preacher says is, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. And everybody in the audience knows. So slave master shaking his head, and the slaves shaking their head too, because the slaves know.
Different meanings.
Right, different meanings, exactly. So from there, it's always been inherently rhetorical because it's subversive. And so when you're operating from the perspective of the dominant culture, you have the ability to claim not to be rhetorical. I don't think you can not be rhetorical ever. Matter of fact, my argument is you have to use rhetoric to defeat rhetoric that you're not using. Right? You have to be rhetorical, right? So there's matter of fact, we pride ourselves, as every field does, that you can't even talk, no matter what your research brings forth, to express it, you're being rhetorical. So we are one of the central, disciplines. Everybody says that. No New Testament people say that. I know.
Well, yeah. Well, and you can't begin to unpack Paul and his language against rhetoric without seeing how clever he is in his tools of persuasion. So
exactly.
There's, I think my colleagues would also bear witness to that.
Exactly.
So that's really fascinating. With that chapter, and I found it such interesting reading because you go to great care to kind of recapitulate this whole history of Western rhetoric and the separation that it makes in that history, and critiquing it, and also locating it specifically within matters of black identity and black presence through Zora Thurston's work about the Negro expression, and also talk about the language of signifying from Henry Louis Gates. I wonder if you could carry that just a little bit forward for us, because I think that piece in particular, you've already touched on it by talking about identity, where was it your mother who?
Claimed rhetorical
space. Claimed rhetorical space, because I think that is really important. We don't always think about, and I should say I always don't think about locating rhetoric relative to identity. And I think that's actually the key notion that you're bringing to this in the chapter. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that language as well to familiarize anyone else who needs to learn more about that tradition.
Well, in essence, what I do in the chapter, after I do the Western summary and after I make the argument that African American preaching is inherently rhetorical, I go to Zora Neale Hurston, who folklorist, genius of the South, and she, as an anthropologist, as a folklorist, is very interested in African American preaching. I mean, tremendously. I mean, she records it. She has this famous sermon she recorded in 1932 called "The Wounds of Jesus." It's masterful. She recorded it literally, so you're getting it as it was virtually preached. And then she does something that is critical to me. She argues for something called the characteristics of Negro expression. which means her argument is that black people speaking are an oral people. We've been influenced, yes. The Western culture is textual.
Mhm.
And so, of all Negro telling, she would say folklore story, preaching, she wouldn't say rapping, but rapping has the same characteristics of Negro expression. It's the oral tradition of Africa impacted by the experience of slavery and racism here in America, that it comes together to form what she calls the characteristics of Negro expression. So in the book she lists several of them, like drama.
Mhm.
And she said black people love to dramatize
Right.
stuff. Another one she lists is adornment. We love to adorn. We can't just dunk and run up and dunk. We have to twist and dunk,
Mhm.
or float and dunk, or reverse and dunk, put on a cape and dunk. We adorn stuff, which she calls the desire for beauty. We love to make things beautiful.
Mhm.
So I lay all that stuff out as part of African American preaching, that the characteristics of Negro expression, and all this, of course, is rhetorical. Adorning stuff is rhetorical. So, for example, she uses sermons in Jonas Vanguard is one of her most popular novels. Their Eyes Are Watching God is the most popular, but Jonas Vanguard is the second. So she does a sermon by a preacher named John Pearson, and she a critic in the New York Times says that the poetry of that sermon is too beautiful to be of any one Negro preacher. She writes back that no, there are hundreds of sermons with this level of poetry every Sunday all across America.
Yeah.
That the Negro preacher is an artist, and the first artist that she says intelligible to the masses.
Mhm.
It's her argument. So I lay all that out as being, part of the rhetorical argument, and I found it meaningful. She did this in a book called The Sanctified Church, and she doesn't lay out a full theory. It's snippets that were put together, and so there are a lot of gaps that for interpretation, filling it out. But I love it for its scholarship. It's called The Sanctified Church, and she's really ultimately in the book studying that the sanctified church is more natural to the origins of African religion, African traditional religion, and African expressions here, and that over and against the more refined churches that pick up European practices.
Right.
So she's arguing for the sanctified church.
Right.
And from there, I go to Henry Louis Gates for signifying. And I got to signifying because I did a piece on Jeremiah Wright. First of all, Jeremiah Wright's my pastor. So after the crucifixion by the media, Fox News, etc., taking one piece of the sermon and creating this media crisis around it. So the piece was taken out of context. I know it was taken out of context because after 9/11/01, we put together a book of sermons from different persuasions, and the day of Jerusalem's fall that was taken out of context, the whole goddamn American piece all
Right.
stretched everywhere, taken totally out of context. I knew it was taken out of context because I had edited the sermon to put in the book.
Mhm.
So in a book called A Christian Way Out of the Great Recession for Abingdon, I did a rhetorical read on this whole crisis, this media manufacturing crisis around Jeremiah Wright. So at the press club, I don't know how much you know, but at any rate, there was the blown up media frenzy, of course, connected to Barack Obama. He was Barack Obama's pastor. And at the press club, he gives a 40-minute defense of the black church, or really tells people what the black church is about. So there's a bunch of black preachers, other people who were friends and supporters of his. They were all on the floor, and the media was up in a big balcony, up in a circle. And so he's up there, and they're up there, and we're loving it. I mean, he's rocking the house. I mean, for us down here. And as he's rocking the house, Ober Hendricks leans over to me and says, they're going to crucify him outside of this room.
Mm.
So after he finishes this brilliant lecture on the black church, they have the question and answer session. And all the questions were about the controversy. Nothing that he said, nothing that he just lectured. It was all about the media-made controversy.
It's
Barack
about nothing
Obama,
that happened, yeah.
yeah, goddamn America, about nothing that, so they pay attention to any of that. So in the middle, so he, to me, you know, he goes into black rhetorical form. He signifies, is what I say. So he does the Q sign, you know, which is, Q is a Greek. Oh my God. He signifies, and he's angry. And he's angry because after all of this, for 40 minutes, you ignore all of that, and you ask these questions. But outside the room, signifying don't come off well.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, black people in the room, I know what it is.
Right.
I'm like, please don't signify. Because they're not going to get it. So anyway, I write this piece at the end of it, and I say that it was a defense mechanism to create space for black presence in the midst of this all-white agenda and all-white media.
Yeah.
That he signifies.
And that was its rhetorical force.
That was, yes, he was creating space with black presence. Well, they crucified him in the media the next day. Barack Obama gets up and gives his speech. He jettisons Jeremiah Wright. So I did a rhetorical read in that same book on Obama's speech, called his race speech, you know what they call it, right? On that whole one. I read that as well, just kind of, you know, take it a piece, the persuasive choices, who's the audience, all those kinds of things. And so to deal in define signifying, you have to go to Henry Louis Gates. And the problem in defining signifying is it's hard to define. And I had, you know, at that time, I had a PhD, but I had been signifying so long as part of black culture because we learned two voices.
Mm-hmm. So
I was going to a high school with like less than 10% black people in high school for school, but during the rest of the time, I'm in the hood with my people. And so I'm talking one language over here, another language over here. So, and the parents are saying, make sure you learn that language over there, because that's, you know, to progress in the world, you gotta learn that language over here. But, you know, and signifying was, you know, a part of, it was so natural. So when I got ready to try to put it in intellectual terms, it was hard because, so I say that what Gates found is what I found. He had to signify to talk about signifying.
I see.
You can't describe it.
You had to enact it.
Yeah, you have to, you can't come up with an intellectual definition. You've got to, the definitions you come up with are signifying itself.
Right.
Right.
And draw attention also to the cultural space in which it takes place.
Exactly.
And reveal it for what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I define it, you know, playing the dozens. I try to define both, sometimes it can be very ugly and nasty, and sometimes it can be friends. And then I go back to Zonia Hurston, because in her book, I think it's The Eyes of Watching God, she has the first recorded instance of a woman signifying on a man.
Mm. Yeah, I remember that. That's like
Yeah,
a four-part dialogue there.
Yeah,
Yes.
right, yeah. So I picked it up and dropped that in, and claiming space for a woman's presence in the midst of black male oppression.
Right.
Signifying. So I have since then. There's been an article by Mark McPhail. He does a piece that I have it with me. I haven't read it yet. I just printed it, where he puts Jeremiah Wright as signifying in a broader context of whiteness and gives it much more volume than I just did a couple pages on it in the book.
Right.
He gives it much more volume. But signifying, and so then I started exploring that the preacher is signifying on the devil with God. You know, I mean, sometimes the preacher is signifying on God. I mean, this whole signification thing. So I haven't written much about it since then.
Yeah.
I have a group of PhD students who are writing on it, who are very interested in it, and I've seen 3 papers in this last class signifying.
Right.
And
It's generative.
Yeah,
Generative
it's
research.
right. It's generative research. So basically, I'm trying to understand ultimately how does a preacher, how does an orator take a people from despair to hope? How does that happen? What are the tools? What are the so that's ultimately.
And some of that's making a presence known.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Yeah.
Very much, or even signifying to make God's presence known, creating rhetorical space for God.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, and here we are close to a chapel where Howard Thurman
yeah,
was a preacher who certainly in his own rhetorical way, we were joking here earlier about Thurman's use of silence as a way of really making space for God in some sense,
exactly.
especially in the life of the imagination of the believer.
One of my PhD students is doing his name is Justin West. He's doing his dissertation on preaching power.
Yeah.
And so I've been reading his papers in class, and I think he's going to have a fairly definitive. There's some work already been done, but I think he's going to have a definitive statement about it.
Beautiful. Well, I'm fascinated with this, and I have one more question, but I want to remind everyone out there that if you want to send in a question, you can send in an email to donahue@bu.edu. So if you're watching this on live stream, there's a way for you to participate. You just got to email it to that address on the screen. Hope you'll want to take part. But before I turn it to questions from the gathered audience here, I just want to ask, and coming back to this book that many of us have been using in classes, 9/11/01, you've talked a lot about Jeremiah Wright and how your recent work on rhetoric and theology in some ways sort of deepens and recasts your appreciation for what Jeremiah Wright does in the book. What I love about this book is that there's a whole spectrum of people involved. T.D. Jakes and a number of people, and I'm wondering, 20 years after, and knowing what you now know and where your own research has gone on the work we've just been discussing about rhetoric and theology and the role of Negro expression and signifying, when you look back on that book, on the sermons that are in that volume, and maybe even think back on the event that precipitates it all, how has your mind changed? What do you sense now among the sermons that you helped gather for this book that might help us come to a deeper understanding of the way they were engaged as situational preachers?
First, we did that book in probably 3 months. It's the fastest book we've ever done. I've ever done. Martha Simmons and myself, we put it together just to say we got to get this while it's hot because people were saying different things.
Right.
There's a wide ideological perspective on interpreting this.
And there was fight over it. Even then, there were fights over the interpretation.
Right.
Yeah,
So
I do remember that.
There's one interpretation that's a red, white, and blue. God bless the flag. We
Right.
attack. And there's a chickens coming home to roost interpretation.
Right.
And so we just took, folks that were representative of the African American pulpit and just kind of gathered their responses and looked at them. We didn't make any judgments. We did not censor anybody necessarily, though. We have to edit stuff because some of it was a little bit long, that kind of thing. But basically, we just tried to represent the spectrum of what the thought is in the black church relative to 9/11/01.
Right.
Particularly because people are trying to figure out what to preach and what to say, and that's why we did it in 3 months. It was 3 months from phone call to book in hand, 3 months, because people were looking for resources.
Right.
And you could read them. Hopefully the sermons would inspire you to your own.
Right.
So looking at it now, I'm excited about the work still because we did a great job to get it done. But I have a different language for it now. The language that I have that's in the Dangerous Sermon book is moral imagination. That when there's a crisis, that has to be responded to. I guess the best way to phrase it is, we're used to imagination functioning in science.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody's imagination didn't conceive of internet and streaming, we wouldn't be, at least, it don't be to just people. So we're used to,
Right.
we're used to imagination in medicine, vaccines, and we're looking for one now, given this present.
Right.
That it takes imagination. It takes science, yes, but it takes imagination. What we're less thinking about is moral imagination. And so I think that we have a a severe lack of moral imagination. That we still haven't figured out how to overcome tribalism. That Martin King that the black church had an imagination that was beyond the tribalism. You know that phrase that that if we march just as King with nonviolence and love, it will be said that there lived a great black people who injected a new meaning into civilization. That's his moral imagination. I don't even think it's his moral, his alone. It's his out of the tradition that's trying to see something broader and deeper than this experience of slavery, tribalism, racism, being marginalized, dehumanized, and etc. And so I think that a dangerous sermon is a sermon whose moral imagination challenges the systems and upsets the dominant hierarchy that's operative. And you get in trouble for preaching like that. But you preach out of that because I had a big definition. I should know it in the book on what moral imagination is. I wrote this. It's something that when there's a crisis, seeing both God and God's hand. So there's a preacher looking at an audience of distraught teenagers who are just wiped out by a murder in the community, or it could be lynching, or it could be. So I told you I have a PhD student who's doing their dissertation on looking at, just like we put those sermons together, what sermons were preached after Emmett Till was killed,
Right.
and comparing those to what sermons were preached after Trayvon Martin was killed.
Right.
To look at that, and what kind of moral imagination? How do we to look at a crisis and be able to see, God's hand, or create a space for God's work by vision and imagination? And I think that as a nation, we don't have much moral imagination. Or I said to you this morning, we're still trying 20th century solutions, 21st century problems, because if a leader, I say this in the book, that if you're not careful, a country will adopt the imagination of the leader. And I don't want the imagination of our present leader. It's too small. Trying to figure out a better way to say it. That's good. That's good. It's an imagination for one group of people.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And I want an imagination that includes. So remember, I said this to you, and we've had some of this conversation about what Ruby Sales says, is that the pressure is often on much of the black church to do liberation theology, but she says, she's looking for a white liberation theology.
Right. Yeah.
So what is the moral imagination of the white church?
Right.
And so if she argues that in the midst of a technocratic capitalism, when the jobs are going all over the globe and in towns and in cities, the same thing in the black community, urban black communities, and in some of these areas of white folks, the jobs are gone, the factories close, and because the white church has no, this is my language, moral imagination, they have no word to speak to the people, because capitalism is the unseen God. You can't critique capitalism in this culture. That's the unknown God of America, is capitalism. And so because you can't critique you got to find, so it's the immigrants. Immigrants are taking our jobs. The blacks are taking, it's always somebody taking our job,
right,
because we can't critique the real problem. So because the white church had no answer, then when Trump comes in and provides them an answer, they latch to it. But where's the church? Where's the? She says, I'm looking for a theology that helps people be more humane, rather than that appeals to the worst in the nature of people. So that's moral imagination.
Yeah. And
because the church has no answer, it opened a window wide where the fears, the frustrations, the negative emotions can be played on, because the church has no strong. The moral imagination isn't big enough to include other people.
Right.
It's not. And that can be the critique of the black church. You know, do we have enough imagination to include same-sex people, transgender people? Do we have enough imagination to include immigrant people? Do we have, or do we just have moral imagination for our group?
Yeah.
And I want my moral imagination to be big, so I say stuff like, why would I want your kids to be put in a cage, and I don't want my kids put in a cage?
Yeah.
Why would I want health care for my children but not want health care for your children?
Yeah.
What? Tell me.
How does that work?
Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah.
And then, particularly being a Christian, so somebody explain that to me.
Yeah.
You know, so I want health care for all children. And to me, it's a moral issue. We make it a political issue and all that kind of stuff, with government. Okay, no, that's not the issue.
Mm.
We ought to be able to find a way to make sure that everybody in the nation has the ability to get health care when they need it.
Mm.
And it might be that our small-sightedness, if this virus goes a certain direction, it may be that our small-mindedness and small-sightedness will come back to haunt us. And maybe it'll transform us and help us to see the benefit. It ain't just you paying for somebody else's health care.
Right.
No, it's something about a social fabric, and that something can leak in and just go wild because people don't have adequate health.
And so a public failure over things like public health becomes an occasion to rethink the possibilities of a moral imagination of dominant communities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. And then, okay, so if you preach a sermon like that, how are you going to survive it?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm working on now. And when I finish that, which is virtually finished, I sent a copy of this back. So May 15th is supposed to be the date. I'm going to write The God of the Dangerous Sermon. Because if you preach a docile sermon, it says something about your God. Or if you preach a status quo sermon, it says something about your God.
Right. Is this of a piece with the question you were asking me earlier about what does a white liberation theology look like, or a liberative theology look like in white dominant communities?
Yeah, I'm using the word liberative to take the pressure off liberation, because as soon as you say liberation theology, you're thinking Latin America, or
Right.
you're thinking black, and so those words are already. What do we use the word liberative? Tell me what's liberative in your faith,
Yeah.
or in your preaching.
Mm.
I mean, what do people need liberation from?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about that.
Right.
And rather than arguing over black liberation theology, arguing over black theology,
Right.
it's sexy to argue with black people or Latin American people and all that. No, let's talk about this. What's liberative about your tradition and your preaching? I can talk to you what's liberative about mine,
Right.
and you can talk to me what's liberative about yours.
Right.
And then so how you define that, and I think, this is only my opinion, it could be wrong, I don't think that the majority of American culture is interested in liberation.
Mm.
I think the majority, just tweak it a little bit, I say this, I think that the majority of American people would be fine with Trump if he stopped tweeting, if he would, be more quote unquote presidential, take some rough edges off, they'd be fine.
Yeah.
All right, there's no big 49% of people, it's 49% approval rating.
Yeah.
That tell you right there, right? So people want the edges tweaked. They don't want liberation, because you have to. Let me say this and I'm done. The way that we've set the paradigm up is that wherever there is black or minority progress, white people feel like they've lost something.
Yeah.
And that's a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that when black people make progress, white people feel like they lost something? Why can't you see that as a gain for the greater good or something like that? And see, that's a question.
It's also a question of rhetorical frame. I
Right.
mean, from the standpoint of the leadership of preaching, the theological leadership we do as a pulpit,
Right.
it's also inviting people into a different way of thinking about that.
So it's almost like the pie ain't big enough. So
Right.
I've got to compete with you more. So I have to keep my dominance.
Right.
And so I don't think that the country is really interested in liberation. I think they're interested in tweaking and small changes to keep the basic lifestyle moving. We're the best nation in the world. You can't get this lifestyle anywhere else. And when you get up and start talking about radical change, it upsets some stuff. So
There's a cost. Yeah. Well, at this point, I want to invite some of the gathered people here to ask questions or make comments. And at another point, we'll turn to see if we have any questions online. But I first want to open it up to my colleagues and students here. Any questions for Dr. Frank Thomas?
can I do one more quote out of Ruby Sales and then
Okay.
contextual? She says that when we talk like this, this is my interpretation. She says white people get defensive, and she says there's nothing wrong with being Euro-American.
Mm-hmm.
She said the only issue is how do you act out that history? And some people act out that history in terms of dominance, and other people act out that history in terms of some sense of equality or some sense of moving forward in a very different direction. So she says, isn't that wrong, Ben? So when you start talking like, we start speaking for black presence and black issues, get defensive, like then there's this whole cycle of guilt. I gotta get guilty about my past. I ain't talking about guilt, right? We're talking about how you act out history. And if you act out your history in a cooperative and a meaningful, and we all can build together a nation, that's one. And white people do that, and I'm fine, and I'm glad to work with them, But once you start talking this dominant stuff, and then same thing, there are African Americans who talk dominant stuff. So the goal is to dominate women, dominate same sex. No, I'm not talking dominance. I'm talking about how do we build something that all of us in this nation, because there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with being anybody that God made. I mean, straight, heterosexual, gay. I mean, white, black. Latinx. Is how you act out. So I don't know. I always throw that in because I always feel not that you're defensive in any measure. I just know we get into this binary, and that's not the issue. It's how if I act out that black preaching is the best preaching tradition in the world, and we're over here, we're better than everybody. If I act that out, that's a dominance hierarchy. But I just happen to think that though black preachers are some of the best preachers in the world, we learned some stuff based upon our experience ahead of some folks. And we can both teach and receive and be in dialogue and learn.
And so here we go. Any questions? Responses? Yes.
I have a number of questions, but I'm trying to limit them. So I'll ask two questions, and you can respond to whichever one you want.
Okay.
The first is a very quick one, which is, how do you think the increased use of mediated worship is impacting our understanding and practice of black preaching? So before you've always had mediated worship, and particularly with black preaching, all the way going back to, the recordings of black preachers in the 30s and 40s and so on. But it was always the province of a very particular group of popular preachers or mega churches who could afford to broadcast their worship. But now, everybody's on YouTube. Everybody's worship is on Facebook Live. Everybody is a part of the mass mediation of worship, which, going back to your press club discussion, changes the nature of the community you think you're talking to. When you're not just talking to the gathered body, but you're constantly negotiating the presence of this media, and my voice now is going out there. Who do I think I'm talking to, and how does that change the way we think about what we're preaching?
I think that basically you've already answered the question. It's a challenge to us. And in Surviving a Dangerous Sermon, I talk about moral orders. There's two dominant, following Lake he calls it the nurturing parent, and these are the progressives. We got the dominant, strict father, daddy, strict father, authoritarian, and so if you're preaching and you don't understand, you're speaking to dual audiences and learn how to bridge an audience. It's one thing when you're speaking to everybody who agrees with you. It's another thing when you're speaking to people who don't agree with you, or if you're interested in reaching people who don't agree with you. Or sometimes, as at the press club, I ain't interested. Look, I'm claiming space for a black presence here. That this has been such an assault. No, I'm not trying to reach y'all. I'm just trying to get y'all up off me. So signifying was always a way to get people up off you. But given that fact, I think it takes a lot more, I call it in the book moral dexterity, that I'm being heard by various audiences. And, you know, I think about, you know, somebody like T.D. Jakes, you know, talking to him about when he preaches, his audience is all over the globe. And I did an interview with Bishop, female, I'll think of it in a minute. She does his Wednesday night service. And I asked her, what's the difference preaching to an international audience versus a national audience? So I think in this age where communication is mediated across so many platforms and you can be heard anywhere in the world, pulled up, you had better start being precise. That's why I went back and did the correction of the piece about it's not being white, it's your, because I'm going to be heard by multiple audience rather than just one. So I think it takes more study, I think it takes more work, I think it takes more listening, I think it takes being subject to critique. Because sometimes you don't know you're offending an audience till they tell you, right? We don't offend an audience necessarily on purpose, so you learn. Or somebody will, you know, 3 sisters came up to me, I was preaching somewhere and said that was offensive. I said, what was offensive about it? And they told me it was offensive about it, right? So I learned from that. So I think it takes more preparation. I don't think you can be slipshod. As a matter of fact, thank you for this question. In Surviving a Dangerous Sermon coming out now, I did a rhetorical read of Jasper Williams' eulogy of Aretha Franklin that caused so much stir. And I make some suggestions about what might have been helpful to be heard by an audience that you're not familiar with, or an audience that is on a different moral order than what you subscribe to. Does that make any sense? Yes. Okay. But see, I think that's rhetorical. I think that who's the audience? And so I said, you know, we talked about this last night. That, you know, in rhetoric, they have the first persona, which is the speaker, which is the persona that I bring. The second persona is the persona of the audience. And so in my head, I imagine an audience, and so I write to the audience in my head. The third persona is somebody's left out and somebody is silenced. The fourth persona is a persona who's adopted when people in the room know that the speaker is lying. They know the speaker is lying, but they conspire with the speaker as if the speaker is telling the truth.
Oh.
An example, somebody, there's a rhetorical article written on J. Edgar Hoover, and that whole piece about his own sexuality and then covering it as who knew it and silence. And then last one is, they call it the null persona, where you threaten my job, and then you have a meeting and ask me what I think. But I can tell you what I think. So I'm gonna sit there and nod my head because my job is on the line. So rhetoric divides this stuff up in the audiences. That's why I appreciate rhetoric so much, because it gives us another lens to look at theology.
I do have one other question. I hate to monopolize, but I have to go to a meeting, so but I want to get this one in.
Go ahead.
I've been really wrestling with where black preaching in the rhetorical tradition that you theorize will find its space in light of 2 realities. Number one, the increasingly post-church landscape of American spirituality.
Yes.
And number 2, in terms of black public rhetoric, the increasing reality of that space being filled by authors, activists, athletes, and activists who are willing to partner with the church still, as Leah Gunning Francis talks about in her book, they're willing to partner, but a precondition of that partnership is that black clergy don't occupy central space in terms of public voice. So both in terms of what's going on within the church and what's going on in black public spaces, it feels to me like there is an increasing hesitancy, suspicion, or sometimes outright hostility to the presence of the kind of black rhetorical force
Outside of normal church.
that has been a part of our tradition. So as that goes on, where will black preaching find room for itself?
I think that there are a generation of younger preachers. I have 5 millennials in my PhD program who are pushing the envelope on the very same questions that you ask, who are challenging, this whole church dominant or the black preacher as the answer for all of the needs of the community, and kind of thing. And so you got some examples of that. Jamal Bryant might be an example of a kind of preaching style that is, for some of that is decentering the text, which I don't like, because these folk don't know the text, right? So you got a challenge. And I'll give you an example of forced rhetoric. I remember I was in Chicago, and Louis Farrakhan went down with the Fruit of Islam and cleaned up Cabrini Green Project. It was a project, I think it was Cabrini Green, could be the Taylor one. They wiped all that away now. And there was a big controversy because a group of the Christian ministers got to the news media and said they just doing that for converts. But Grandmama said, since Farrakhan and them at Fruit of the Nation of Islam has been down here, I can actually go to the grocery store. I actually can take my little girl, my granddaughter, to school. I heard her say that. And so when they asked me to get involved, I said, I'm not getting in that. Now, if we felt like, why didn't the Christian people go down there and clean the neighborhood up? The neighborhood's cleaned up. So whoever's cleaning the neighborhood up, I'm willing to partner with. I don't have to be in charge. I know that's not everybody's perspective, but I think we're being pushed to that. So whether or not we accept that, that's what the people are saying. So what is the church going to do if the people say, if you have to be in charge with your agenda, you're not helping us and we don't need you. We don't have to meet in your churches. Matter of fact, we got phones. I can get on my phone right now and get 500 young people to be you in a half hour for a meet. We can meet at the coffee shop. We don't need your spaces. As a matter of fact, this is my thought, I know you got to go, is that it used to be that the church was the place of convening. But with the cell phone and Starbucks, young people are convening. I can get my phone and have 500 of my friends here on this corner in 15 minutes. Now, you can get with us, but we love to have you, but y'all not going to run it. And I just think if the church is going to survive, it's got to deal with that, accept that, and move on.
Thank you so much.
Any responses from online? No? All right, I'm going to open up any other questions if there are any. I want to come back. We're about to close of our time as it is, and I just want to come back to the fact that you've got Prathia Hall, a sermon by her at the end of How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. There's history here, and we're here in the faculty meeting room, which if any of you have ever been here, you know it's adorned by important pictures of people who really shaped this institution and people who are shaping this institution. And I just think that's so important to remember Prathia Hall here. And wouldn't mind if you would maybe conclude by talking a little bit about her sermon at the end of your book.
Freedom, Faith.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 pieces to that. First, I had a tremendous relationship with Prathia. So let me get to the larger point. One of the things that I'm trying to do is there are underexposed people in the African American preaching tradition. So some of what I do is every book I write, I can't get it done because it depends on the page count. I try to include a voice that probably is not published. Now, Courtney Pace did the work on Pray For You, so now it's published. But I'm trying to, I think I did Jeremiah Wright, and one of these books I did, he's published, but his voice. So I'm always trying. We have tons of African American preachers who are unpublished.
Right.
Tons of them. So I say in every book I write, I'm going to try to include one voice that's unpublished to put them out there as best I can.
Right.
Parathea particularly chose her because we had a relationship, and it came out of, in the 1980s, Vincent Harding had a conference in Colorado for people who were working for social justice. He called it Religion and Spiritual Transformation or something. That was his. So we were all there together, and it broke out that a fight broke out because some of the men were not supportive of women preachers, and he had everybody that's working for social justice in the room. And the fight broke out, and it got, these folks did not want women to be authoritative. And so Parathea was right in it. So we had breakfast the next morning. I said, Parathea, I'm really very supportive of you all having equal voice. She said, Frank, but you didn't say anything in the room. She said, we needed you yesterday. As a matter of fact, we need you for the rest of the retreat. She didn't demean me. She did not criticize me. And I said, Parathea, you're right. I didn't say anything in the room. So I left there and started saying stuff in the room, what I thought, what I felt. And so she respected that. So we built a relationship. And she was always amazed that I didn't get offended. No, you were telling the truth. And why would I get offended at the truth? That's the truth. I didn't say anything. And I've been a pastor. I've been in a pastor where people shoot you to pieces in the meeting, and then after the meeting, the people call you up. My analogy for it is like the sheriff fights the bad guy, and all the townspeople stay behind the shutters, right? And the bad guys beat up the sheriff. Then when the bad guys are gone, people come and they run away. So I think she was just tremendous with her faith and the sermon, Freedom Faith. She was just a voice who fought for justice, and I wanted to both. I wrote that story in the book,
Right.
And I wanted that sermon because heretofore her work really had not been published.
Right.
And Courtney Pace, of course, did a wonderful job. But that's how. And then I was with her at United. She was at United. I was in the DMIT program. She was the director of the DMIT program. So we just had a relationship when she came here. And I appreciated her telling me in the way she told me that I didn't stand up.
Sure. Do not fear the truth.
Right.
Yeah. So I believe we have one quick question. We have time for one quick one. Yes, Dana.
It's a basic question. Part of my ministry is I preach inside jails, pastor prison, part of my ministry. And you began this lecture by mentioning preaching hope. What passages would you recommend? It's just a basic question.
Yeah, that's not very basic. That's a hard question, but it's an easy question too. I think the texts are full of I just took, hope has to be mined, M-I-N-E-D, dug up. And so there are some passages that are very difficult to dig up hope, but there's some with the preacher's moral imagination, studying exegesis. So I just preached a sermon on Cain and Abel, or at least Abel, Cain being given leniency by God. God confronts Cain. And God says, I'm going to put a mark on. You're going to be out of here. You're going to live in the land of Nod. And Cain says, I can't take that punishment. So God says, I'm going to put a mark on you so nobody can bother you. Cain goes into the land of wandering and rebuilds He gets a wife, he has a son, he gets a city. And I grapple within the sermon that Laquan McDonald was shot by police officer Jason Van Dyke in Chicago, Illinois. And the judge was lenient on Jason Van Dyke. God was lenient on Cain. Except Abel don't get to have a family. Jason Lawrence McDonald,
Yep, I got it.
and so I grapple this thing out. I just grapple it out and come to. Now I gotta do quick. I'll do quick. I'm running time is running.
Yep.
That families are casualties of murder. So you get the family of the police officer, wife, on the stand, crying, begging for mercy from the judge. You get the McDonald family on the stand saying, we want the full measure of the law. And I say in the sermon, I want the full measure. I want Cain to get it. I want the police officer to get the full measure of the law. He was convicted of second-degree murder, 16 counts of battery with a weapon. And then it hit me, I want that until it's my child, until it's my daughter, until it's my spouse. So it hits me that if my son had committed a murder, I have a son who's 38, I would be on the stand in front of the judge, pleading for mercy. Or if that had been my son who was killed, I'd be on the stand talking about the full measure of the law. So I say God was lenient and God was merciful because God wants to stop killing and murder. And we, and I, and you, and me have got to come stop this system. It victimizes both the police officer and because we don't ever think about the fact that for every police officer that's killed, it makes it more dangerous for a black kid. And every black kid that's killed, it makes it more dangerous for a police officer. You know what everybody wants? Their loved ones to get home safe. And so how do we get active for justice to create an environment where everybody can get home safe? That the wife of Jason Van Dyke, what she wanted that night was her husband to get home safe. What the parents of Laquan McDonald wanted was that boy to get home safe. And so I had to mine that into hope. And I mined it into hope because the rage of the verdict was eating me alive. The rage of it. So he ended up with 7 years, which means 3 years with probation. With probation, he could serve 3 years. So after the press conference, they're celebrating. We're gonna see our father again. But Laquan McDonald don't get to see that.
There's no future.
So my job, I think, which is why I hope I got all these degrees and doing the study that I end up doing, is to try to find hope in that text. There's some obvious things, that weeping may endure for night, but joy comes in the morning. There's obvious hope, but it really has to be applied to a situation. And when applied, it has to be mine, which is my definition of moral imagination.
Okay, let's hear
You say
it.
sent one. He says, which did you say was with us?
He was last night at the dinner.
He says, how can a preacher serving a multi-ethnic congregation create the rhetorical space you suggest? I think the rhetorical space can be restricted by a certain race, culture, or language. Perhaps it can become homogenous and closed to other rhetorical ways of naming.
Yes.
How can we deal with this complex issue, perhaps with the moral imagination, but how?
Thank you so much. I would love to answer that question. It's basically, do you see other people as human beings? So let's take the example I just said. Normally what we do is take a side. So either we take the police side or we take the black kid side, right? And if we take, we don't see that that there's a mother and a family on the stand crying because they want their boy to get home safe, right? We throw that away. Or we could be on the black folks side. We could be looking at it that this police officer, he just full extent of the law. I mean, he's a murderer, he's a killer, full extent of the law, and miss that you got a family and kids and all that stuff. So the question is, do you see the humanity of anybody other than folks outside of your group? It's a human question. So you put people in cages and you're okay with that because you don't see them as human or at the same level of humanity as your group. Now your group is human. Because if I see your kid is human and my kid is human, I don't want your kid in the cage, I want my kid in the cage.
Right.
So I think it's like, which leads to me, which is why I'm doing the God of the danger. Is your God a tribal God for your tribe? Or is this the God of the human family?
Professor, that's so honest. Because a lot of the young men I speak to between 20 and 25, look at 25 to life, taking a life. And the first thing they want to do is they want to pray for my justice, pray for me. So the first thing I always bring to their mind is I'm praying for justice. The first time I said that, gosh, what? Because they don't factor in the reality that you've taken someone's family, right? You've taken someone else's life. What about them? And so often that gets erased. And all okay, black, white, doesn't matter. People say, like you said, this is just about me. Right? Forget about them, forget about you. Right? As preachers, our job is to bring forth the truth of what is right. Just that simple. What's right, man?
Except if I got a tribal God. I mean, I think I'm doing right.
That's unfortunate.
I mean, well,
This type of God is real.
I mean, so,
He's
so
very real.
Yeah, but when you see some of this stuff, now, I don't think that people intentionally do wrong. I think that they justify to themselves that this is right. These are murderers, these are criminals. So, Michael Brown gets choked to death. We all watch it on television, by 6 police officers, and then the response is, well, if he hadn't been selling cigarettes, the police wouldn't have stopped him. What the hell do you mean? Because I'm selling cigarettes, I deserve to be choked to death? See, but that's other. That's that stereotype of people in the hood being murderers and thugs. And some of that's true. I can't deny that. But that still don't mean that somebody has to be shot 16 times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It's up to you.
Yeah.
You're okay with that?
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I'm working on a paper now that I'm presenting next week where I talk about white pulpits utilizing a hermeneutic of minimization that denies race in the other and in themselves. And as you were talking about signifying, I was curious, and I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation, but I was curious in ways in which white supremacy and white racism uses signifying to reinscribe whiteness, but then says, oh no, that's not what we're talking about. So like a lot of the rhetoric used by a certain party or a certain leader is clearly having to do with race,
Right.
and it minimizes race, but then they, through rhetoric, largely say, oh no, that's not what we're talking about. Or the example that you just gave is a great example of, well, he was selling cigarettes. That just makes it, the claim with that is, okay, this isn't about race, it's about illegally selling cigarettes, when in reality, we all know that it's about race. And I'm wondering if you would call that like a form of white signifying that preserves whiteness, or is that not quite the term that you're using, or just something different? Or?
I'd have to think about that. I don't know that. It's a great question. I don't know that.
Interesting.
Cool,
I know.
Because it's
Well, there's ways in which every cultural tradition signals things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And in some ways, signifying, as you've described it, is for the preservation of black people and African American bodies. And in my example, it's a preservation of whiteness.
Right.
which exerts itself
Oh,
in extremely
fascinating.
negative ways.
Which is, you know, my first comment is long, so, you know, they would lynch people and say it's about crime, it's not about race.
Yeah,
Well, you know, only black people being lynched, or I mean, Jews and Catholics, yeah, but, so it's all, that's a mantra, it's never about race. It's
Yeah.
always, it's crime, it's always about something other than that.
exactly, yeah.
And,
And that's,
and
yeah.
you know, you can do, I can even do, you know, I watch Morning Joe, and it's an aversion to talk about race. And race is hard to talk about, but it's every other reason. You know, it's the economic insecurity, you know, and some of that's true. It's this, it's that. It's everything but race. We can't even get it on the field
Yeah,
to be an option like other options.
yeah,
It's just total denial. So I
yeah.
agree with you. I have to think about calling it. But you may be right. I like to see what you come up with, you know. So push it. I'll read it and I'll quote you.
Alright.
Let me thank you, Dr. Frank Thomas, for this rich dialogue and the ways in which I think you engage us and try to speak to us, across us, with us. It's been really rich, and I'm grateful for that. I think everyone gathered here is too. I hope those of you who've been listening to the live stream have enjoyed it too. If you've sent in a question, we'll try to respond to it by email in this case. But wish you all the best. So thank you for attending this event of the Homiletical Theology Project, Center of Practical Theology with Dr. Frank Thomas. And bye-bye.